At a dusty Texas gas station, Walter Griggs, a humble veteran, faces disrespect when clerk Jason denies him service over a faded ID. Silently enduring mockery, Walter retreats, his Silver Star medal hinting at untold valor. Suddenly, a military convoy arrives, led by Captain Martinez, revealing Walter as a heroic lieutenant colonel who thwarted a major terrorist attack. As the crowd grapples with their misjudgment, questions linger. Why did Walter choose silence? What ceremony awaits him? Uncover the truth behind his sacrifice in the secrets this quiet hero holds in this gripping tale of honor and redemption. Love stories of unsung heroes? Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales like Walter's. Hit that button, join our community, and help us honor those who serve in silence. Share your thoughts below. Have you witnessed unrecognized valor? Support us and keep these stories alive. The Texas sun scorched the cracked asphalt of the small highway gas station, its relentless heat baking the air into a shimmering haze. The station was a transient hub, a fleeting stop for travelers who passed through like ghosts, their faces blurring into anonymity. Truckers, road trippers, and restless commuters moved in a rhythm dictated by the hum of engines and the clink of coins. Amid this bustle, Walter Griggs, a man of 70 whose weathered face bore the etchings of a life hard-lived, stood patiently in line. His threadbare jacket, once a proud garment of fine wool, now frayed at the cuffs, hung loosely on his gaunt frame. In his trembling hand, he clutched a faded veteran's card and a crisp $20 bill. The paper worn but deliberate, like a relic of a past he carried quietly. Inside, the station thrummed with restless energy. A family squabbled over candy bars, their voices sharp and impatient. A trucker, his boots caked in dust, counted change for a coffee. Commuters glanced at their watches, their minds already miles down the road. Behind the counter stood Jason, a clerk barely out of his teens, his gums snapping rhythmically as he scrolled through his phone. His name tag, tilted at an angle that suggested he'd rather remain nameless, gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights. His eyes, when they lifted, carried the boredom of a young man who saw the world as a series of inconveniences. When Walter reached the counter, his presence seemed to anchor the fleeting chaos of the station. His voice, low and steady, cut through the din. "I need to fill my tank," he said, extending the veteran's card with a hand that trembled not from fear but from age and old wounds. "Will this suffice for identification?" Jason barely glanced at the card, its edges soft from years of handling, before his lips curled into a dismissive smirk. "No ID, no service," he said, his tone flat, as if the words were a script he'd recited 100 times. Walter's face remained unreadable, but a flicker of something, resignation, perhaps, passed through his pale blue eyes. "I understand," he said softly, reaching into his jacket to produce a photocopy of an old military ID, the ink faded to near illegibility. "This is the only other identification I have at present." Jason didn't bother to take it. He leaned back, popping his gum louder, and waved a hand. "Not good enough. Next." The words landed like a slap, sharp and careless. Behind Walter, a woman in a bright red sundress snickered, her voice carrying just enough to sting. "Acting like a general when you can't even afford a proper ID," she muttered, her words dripping with mockery. A ripple of laughter spread through the line. A man in a baseball cap shook his head, his expression a mix of pity and amusement, as if Walter's quiet dignity was a performance gone wrong. Walter said nothing. His lips pressed into a thin line, and with a single nod, he tucked his papers back into his pocket. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each action was a choice to preserve something deeper than pride. He stepped away from the counter, his shoulders squared despite the weight of the moment, and made his way to a weathered bench behind the station, out of sight from the curious and the cruel. The rejection lingered in the air, unnoticed by most, but heavy for those who saw. A boy, no older than 10, tugged at his mother's sleeve as they passed the counter. "Mom, why did they send that man away?" His voice was small but piercing, his wide eyes searching for an answer that made sense. His mother, her arms full of snacks, shushed him with a quick glance, her discomfort palpable. She had no words to explain the casual dismissal of a man whose life she couldn't begin to fathom. Walter, now seated on the bench, seemed oblivious to the station's pulse. The heat pressed down on him, But he sat unmoving, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the road disappeared into the haze. Years in desert combat zones had taught him to endure. Heat, pain, disrespect. They were all just storms to weather. Inside his jacket, Walter's fingers brushed against three items he carried like talismans. He drew them out slowly, as if each held a piece of his soul. The first was a photograph of a young girl, her smile frozen in time, her eyes bright with a joy that Walter hadn't seen in decades. The second was a letter, its official seal worn but unmistakable, its contents a private weight he carried alone. The third was a silver star medal, its surface catching the sunlight with a gleam that seemed to defy the station's grime. It was one of the highest honors for Valor, a testament to a courage most would never know. Walter's eyes, clouded with memories of battles fought and lives lost, lingered on each item. His fingers traced the medal's edges, and for a moment, his stoic mask softened, revealing a man who had seen too much yet still chose silence over protest. He returned the items to his pocket with the same care he'd given them for years, as if they were the last anchors to a life he could still claim. Inside the station's cramped security office, the exchange replayed on a grainy black and white monitor. The assistant manager, a woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, rewound the footage twice, her frown deepening. "Did you really need to be that harsh?" she asked Jason when he sauntered in for his break, his sneakers scuffing the floor. He scoffed, grabbing a soda from the mini-fridge. "Please," he said, cracking the can open. "Every other day, some old guy comes in waving a veteran card, looking for a discount or special treatment. It's always the same sob story." The assistant manager raised an eyebrow, her voice steady but pointed. "He didn't ask for either." Jason shrugged, unperturbed. "Whatever. Rules are rules. No proper ID, no service." His words were a mantra, a shield against accountability, but they left a sour taste in the air. Outside, Walter remained on the bench, his stillness a stark contrast to the station's restless energy. The heat was oppressive, but he made no move to seek shade, as if it were just another test of endurance. His thoughts were his own, but the set of his jaw suggested a man who had faced worse than a clerk's disdain: war, loss, the slow erosion of time. A middle-aged woman emerged from the convenience store, her arms laden with plastic bags. She paused when she saw Walter, her expression softening for a moment. Perhaps it was the way he sat, alone but unbowed, or the faint glint of the metal he'd tucked away. Her hesitation was brief, a flicker of empathy quickly swallowed by the demands of her own day. She turned away, her footsteps fading into the station's hum. 10 minutes later, the ground trembled, a low rumble that silenced the station's chatter. Heads turned as a convoy of black military SUVs roared into the lot, their tires kicking up dust that swirled in the relentless sun. The vehicles moved with purpose, their presence commanding and unmistakable. The station, so quick to dismiss Walter, now stood frozen, its occupants caught in the weight of something they couldn't yet understand. Who was this man, so easily overlooked, and why had they come for him? The answer, like Walter himself, carried a quiet power that would soon unravel the assumptions of everyone who had laughed, mocked, or simply turned away. The blistering sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of the gas station parking lot, where Walter sat alone on a weathered bench, his frail frame hunched slightly under the weight of years and memories. His faded jacket, patched at the elbows, clung to his shoulders, and his hands rested lightly on his lap, cradling a small silver star, its edges worn smooth from years of quiet handling. Walter's eyes, sharp despite his age, traced the horizon, lost in thoughts of battles long past, of comrades left behind, and of a life that felt increasingly like a distant echo. There was a heaviness in his chest, not just from the heat, but from the quiet ache of being forgotten, of being invisible to a world that once leaned on his courage. A woman in a sundress, her arms laden with grocery bags, paused mid-stride as she passed him, her brow furrowed, a flicker of concern breaking through her hurried thoughts. She saw the weariness in his posture, the way his hands trembled slightly as they clutched the star, and something stirred within her, a mix of compassion and unease. "Sir, are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but laced with worry. "It's awfully hot out here. Do you need me to call someone for you?" Her words hung in the air, genuine but tentative, as if she wasn't sure how to bridge the gap between her bustling life and this stranger's solitude. Walter looked up, his weathered face softening with a small, sincere smile that carried a trace of gratitude. "Thank you, ma'am. You're kind." "I'm fine," he said, his voice steady but quiet, like a man who had learned to carry his burdens without complaint. The woman hesitated, her eyes searching his for a moment longer. "Are you sure? It's really hot to be out here like this," she pressed, her concern deepening as she noticed the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. "I've known hotter days," Walter replied simply, his tone carrying a weight she couldn't quite place, a hint of resilience forged in places far harsher than this sun-scorched lot. She nodded, reluctant to leave, then turned toward her car, glancing back once with a troubled expression, her heart heavy with the sense that she was abandoning someone who needed more than she could give. A sudden gust of wind swept across the lot, sharp and unyielding, snatching the silver star from Walter's lap. It tumbled to the ground, rolling across the asphalt until it came to rest against a crumpled cigarette pack, glinting faintly in the sunlight. Walter leaned forward, his movements slow and deliberate, his breath catching slightly as he reached for it. But before he could retrieve it, the low, guttural roar of a powerful engine cut through the hum of the gas station, pulling his attention to the highway. A sleek black Suburban with tinted windows swung sharply into the lot, its government plates catching the light. A faint military insignia on the door gleamed briefly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. "Whoa! Special forces coming to fuel up," one of the gas station attendants quipped, shielding his eyes against the sun as he grinned at his coworker. But the joke died in his throat as a second identical SUV pulled in, followed by a third, then a fourth. By the time the sixth vehicle rolled into the lot, moving in perfect, disciplined formation, a heavy silence had descended over the station. Customers froze, their hands hovering over gas pumps or half-open car doors, their eyes locked on the convoy as it formed a precise semicircle around the main building. The air felt charged, as if the world had paused to witness something momentous. From the lead SUV, a female officer stepped out, her military dress uniform crisp and impeccable despite the heat. Captain's bars gleamed on her shoulders, catching the sunlight as she scanned the station with a purposeful efficiency that commanded attention. Her presence was magnetic, her posture radiating authority and resolve. "Where is the man who was just denied service?" she asked, her voice cutting through the silence of the forecourt, clear and unwavering. Every head turned, the weight of her questions settling over the crowd like a storm cloud. The clerk, Jason, who had dismissed Walter earlier with a curt wave and a sneer, stepped out from behind the counter, his earlier bravado evaporating under the captain's piercing gaze. His hands fidgeted at his sides and his voice faltered as he stammered, I don't know who you mean." His eyes darted nervously as if he could feel the ground shifting beneath him, the first stirrings of regret creeping into his chest. The captain's hand radio crackled to life, a voice cutting through the static. "Confirm visual on Lieutenant Colonel Walter Griggs. Current location identified as this gas station." The words hit like a thunderclap, and every eye turned to the woman in the sundress, who stood frozen near her car, her grocery bags forgotten in her hands. She pointed wordlessly toward the bench behind the station, her face a mix of awe and guilt as she realized the man she'd spoken to was far more than he appeared. "Ma'am," another officer, a major with a stern but respectful demeanor, approached the captain. "We need to move quickly. The ceremony begins in 90 minutes, and the secretary is already waiting." The captain nodded, her jaw set with determination, and strode toward Walter's bench, her boots clicking against the asphalt with measured precision. 4 uniformed officers followed close behind, their movements synchronized, their faces unreadable but purposeful. The remaining patrons exchanged bewildered glances, their earlier indifference replaced by a growing sense of unease. Who was this old man they had overlooked so easily? What kind of ceremony could demand a military escort of this scale? Jason, still rooted in the doorway, felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. His earlier dismissal of Walter now felt like a grave misstep, and the weight of his mistake pressed against his chest as he watched the officers round the corner of the building. Shame burned in his cheeks, mingling with a creeping fear that he had crossed a line he didn't fully understand. Captain Rebecca Martinez approached Walter with deliberate steps, her eyes locking onto him with a mix of reverence and urgency. When she reached the bench, she stopped, drew herself to full attention, and executed a crisp, perfect salute. Lieutenant Colonel Griggs, sir, Captain Rebecca Martinez, Joint Special Operations Command. We've been trying to reach you, she said, her voice steady but laced with a quiet respect that carried the weight of history. Walter remained seated, his breathing labored, his eyes meeting hers with a mixture of surprise and resignation. It's been many years, he said softly, his voice rough with emotion. I thought no one remembered anymore. The words were heavy with the pain of being forgotten, of carrying the scars of service in a world that had moved on without him. We remember, sir, all of us do, Captain Martinez replied, her voice softening, her eyes reflecting a deep, unspoken gratitude. And today you've been recalled to receive the recognition you've long deserved. From a leather portfolio, she withdrew an embossed envelope bearing the Department of Defense seal, its edges crisp and official. She presented it to Walter with both hands, a gesture imbued with profound respect, as if she were handing him a piece of his own legacy. The Secretary of Defense requests your presence, sir. Your country has not forgotten what you sacrificed. The gas station had fallen into an eerie stillness, the hum of the highway fading into the background, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Jason stood frozen in the doorway, his face flushed with a shame so deep it felt like it might swallow him whole. He had dismissed Walter without a second thought, assuming he was just another transient, unworthy of his time. Now the weight of his error bore down on him, each moment of the unfolding scene etching itself into his conscience. A male officer with major's insignia stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. Sir, we have your dress uniform in the vehicle. The ceremony is scheduled for 1600 hours. Another officer approached Jason directly, his expression hard but not unkind. You just denied service to one of the most decorated special operations officers of the Iraq War, he said, his voice low but cutting. A man who personally saved 23 lives during an ambush in 2005. Jason's mouth opened, but no words came. His mind reeled, grappling with the enormity of what he'd done. The old man he'd brushed off, the one he'd barely glanced at, was a hero, a living legend, whose sacrifices had saved lives and shaped history. The shame was overwhelming, a tidal wave that left him speechless, his heart pounding with regret as he watched the officers guide Walter toward the waiting vehicles, their respect for him palpable in every step. Walter stood slowly, each movement a quiet testament to a life etched with purpose. His shoulders, once bowed by time, now squared with a soldier's pride, revealing the man who had once marched through chaos to protect a nation. His presence, unadorned by medals or fanfare, carried an authority that silenced the hum of the gas station. His eyes, weathered by years of unseen battles, swept over the crowd, some curious, some dismissive, others blind to the weight of his past. I don't need special treatment, Walter declared, his voice cutting through the air with a strength that belied his age. I just want to know if what I sacrificed, my years, my peace, my brothers, still holds meaning for those I protected. His words, raw and unguarded, stirred a flicker of hope within him, though it wrestled with the quiet doubt that had lingered for years. Did the world still value the cost of its freedom? Captain Martinez stepped forward, his uniform a stark contrast to the casual chaos of the gas station. Lieutenant Colonel Griggs led Operation Silent Vanguard, he announced, his voice steady and commanding. Most details remain classified, but his actions stopped the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11. The revelation landed heavily, and Walter felt the weight of those memories, comrades lost, choices made in the dark, press against his chest. The SUVs aligned with precision, and from each emerged service members, their uniforms a tapestry of every military branch. Without a word, they formed a line, their boots striking the pavement in unison. One by one, they saluted Walter, their eyes conveying a respect that words could not. Walter's throat tightened, his heart caught between gratitude and the ache of those who never came home. The crowd's earlier mockery dissolved into silence. Those who had scoffed now stood humbled, some removing their hats, others unable to meet Walter's gaze. He saw their shame but felt no anger, only a quiet understanding that people judge what they cannot see. A young boy slipped from his mother's grasp, his eyes wide with wonder. "Are you a superhero, sir?" he asked, his voice trembling with awe. Walter knelt, his knees protesting, to meet the boy's gaze. Taking the child's hand in his weathered one, he said softly, "No, son, heroes don't need applause. They just need to be seen as human." The boy's innocence stirred memories of a younger Walter, who once believed in heroes too. The boy's mother approached, her face etched with regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We didn't know." Walter nodded, his eyes kind. "Most don't. That's how it's meant to be." The truest battles are the ones history forgets. Inside, he felt the familiar sting of anonymity, yet he carried no bitterness, only resolve. Jason, the young clerk who had dismissed Walter, stepped forward, his bravado gone. "Sir, I'm sorry," he said, his voice shaking. "Sir, if you need to refuel, it's on the house." Walter studied him, seeing not malice but youth. "Life will tempt you to judge quickly," he said. "Remember this moment when it does." Jason nodded, his shame tempered by a resolve to change. As Walter was led to the lead SUV, a single clap broke the silence, spreading until the entire crowd joined in, their applause of belated recognition of the man they had overlooked. Walter didn't turn. The sound stirred gratitude, but also sorrow for those whose sacrifices went unsung. A woman who had checked on Walter earlier to wipe tears away. "I knew," she murmured. "Not who he was, but what he was. You can tell if you look." Her heart vowed to never miss such dignity again. The convoy departed, onlookers bowing their heads as news vans arrived. The station manager refused to name Jason. "This isn't about blame," she said. "It's about learning." Her words carried a promise to do better. A week later, at a press conference, Walter was asked about resentment. "That young man didn't know better," he said thoughtfully. "But he does now. Life's best lessons often come in uncomfortable packages." He felt no anger, only hope for Jason's growth. The gas station transformed. A sign read, "We serve all, with special gratitude to those who served us." Employees were trained to honor veterans, and a display showcased military decorations. 3 weeks later, Jason visited Walter at the VA hospital. "I didn't come to apologize with words, sir," he said, standing by Walter's bed. "I've joined the Veteran Support Network." His earnestness touched Walter, who saw not the careless clerk, but a young man striving to make amends. Walter leaned back in his chair, his weathered hands resting lightly on the armrests as he studied the young man seated across from him. Jason's posture had changed since their last encounter. Shoulders squared, head held high, no trace of the slouch that had once screamed indifference. His eyes, once clouded with impatience, now met Walter's with a clarity that spoke of introspection. The dismissive sneer that had curled Jason's lip was gone, replaced by a quiet resolve that Walter couldn't help but notice. It was a transformation that carried more weight than any string of apologies ever could. Walter's heart stirred with a cautious hope, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself to entertain in years. He gestured toward the empty chair beside him, his voice warm but measured. "Take a seat, Jason. I'd like to hear what brought you here. Why volunteer?" Jason settled into the chair, his movements deliberate, as though he were weighing each action with care. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the table, his brow furrowing as he searched for the right words. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with a vulnerability that surprised even himself. "I've been thinking a lot lately," he began, his gaze dropping to his hands before lifting to meet Walter's again. "About my grandfather. He fought in Vietnam, but he never talked about it. Not once, and I never bothered to ask." His voice cracked slightly, and he swallowed hard, the weight of regret pressing against his chest. "When I saw how those officers treated you at the GO station, with that respect, that acknowledgement, it hit me. How many times did my grandfather walk into a room and wish someone would look at him like that? How many times did he carry that silence, hoping for just a moment of recognition that never came?" Walter nodded slowly, his eyes softening with understanding. The young man's words stirred memories long buried, fragments of a past that still lingered in the quiet corners of his mind. "A lot of us came home to silence," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of years. "Some of us chose it, didn't want to burden others with what we'd seen. Others, well, the world just didn't know how to listen, or didn't care to. He leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing but kind. Is that why you didn't push back that day? Why you let me walk away without a fight? Jason shifted in his seat, the question pulling at something deep within him. He thought back to that moment at the WAF station, the heat of his frustration, the sting of Walter's quiet rebuke. I was angry, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. But when you walked away, it wasn't a weakness I saw. It was strength, like you didn't need to prove anything to me or anyone else. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. I want to be better than who I was that day. Walter's eyes took on a faraway look, as though he were peering into a time and place Jason could only imagine. When you've stared death in the face, he said softly, when you've held your ground through things no one should endure, a thing like being turned away at a gas pump feels small. It's not about pride or winning every fight. Dignity is knowing which battles are worth picking. It's walking away when you could lash out, carrying yourself with a quiet strength because you know what's at stake isn't just your ego, it's who you are. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Walter's words settling over them like a shared confession. Jason felt a tightness in his throat, a mix of shame and gratitude for the chance to glimpse the depth of the man's life. Before he stood to leave, Walter reached into his pocket, his movements slow and deliberate. He pressed a small, worn object into Jason's palm, closing the young man's fingers around it. Jason opened his hand to find a challenge coin, its edges smoothed by time, etched with the insignia of Walter's old unit. He looked up, his eyes questioning. Carry this, Walter said, his voice firm, but laced with a quiet pride. Not to remind you of where you stumbled, but to remind you of who you're becoming because of it. It was more than a weight. It was a symbol of a journey, a testament to growth forged through reflection and resolve. The story of that day at the gas station lingered in both their minds, a moment that had once been marked by misunderstanding, but now stood as a turning point. Walter had held up his veteran's card, a piece of cardboard that had been dismissed as insufficient, unworthy of the respect it deserved. Yet in its quiet insistence, it had transformed a fleeting encounter into something profound. The station had fallen silent, a reverent hush spreading as the weight of Walter's service became clear. That card, so easily overlooked, had carried a story of sacrifice that demanded acknowledgement, not through words, but through the power of its existence. Honor, Jason realized, wasn't something that needed to be shouted or displayed on a badge. It lived in the things a person had endured in silence, the burdens they carried so others could walk in peace. Some mistakes didn't call for apologies. They called for change, for a shift in how one moved through the world. The world didn't need to know who you were until you chose dignity over anger, stepping away with a quiet self-possession that spoke louder than any outburst could. But someone was always watching. Sometimes, like Jason, they returned, not alone, but with a convoy of others, a testament to the ripple effect of a single moment of truth. True recognition, Walter knew, rarely came when you expected it. It arrived later, often when you'd stopped looking for it, when you'd simply continued living by the weight that had earned it. In a world that amplified the loudest voices, the most powerful statements were often made in silence, a silence that carried the weight of stories, of heroes, of lives that would never fade.